Okay, I'm going to try to use the mic. Is it working? Okay. So the message I have today, it's been something that's been on my mind for quite a while. It's not an easy one to talk about. I have two very, emotional stories to share with you guys today. So I'm hoping that I can make it through it without too many tears. God's put this on my heart to talk about it. And it has to do with death. Death and dying are very difficult topics for us to talk about. We don't like to think about it, and we definitely don't want to prepare for it, but it's a part of living in this world. God didn't create us in this beautiful world that we live in to die. He created it to be a paradise for His creation. He was particular and He was perfect when He created this great earth planet, or planet called Earth. And then of all the creation that He's ever created, He created humans to be most like Him. Genesis 1:26 and 27 says, God said, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness." So God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created them, male and female. He created them. We have this understanding that death is a penalty. It's the penalty of sin. It's a punishment. But mercifully and thankfully, God has saved us from eternal death. As we continue to wait in this world for Him to return, we still have to live with the consequences of sin. We have to deal with it. God, being who He is, I believe He used this punishment as a blessing to His children in disguise. Ecclesiastes 7:1 says, "A good name is better than fine perfume, and the day of death better than the day of birth." Even Job, he cursed the day of his birth because he was going through all those trials. He was wanting to die because he needed relief from what he was going through and the situation he was in. God is a loving God, and He is perfect in all of His ways. He wants what is best for us. And death was not a part of His original plan, but is something that we all have to face. I know there's a lot of us here that have been dealing with losing loved ones. And we do find comfort and peace in God, but yet we don't have perfect peace or comfort. Death is not something that we want to accept because it isn't meant to be. We know this, and that's why it's so hard to deal with. It is the greatest loss we face while being here on this world. It's been a little while since I've lost anyone close to me, but I still feel those losses quite a bit. My first experience with death was when I was 12 years old. My aunt passed away from cancer. She was only 42. When I was 15, I was a freshman in high school. A friend of mine, a close friend of mine, had passed away from leukemia. He was only 17. In 1997, just days before school started that year, another classmate of mine got in a car accident and died, and her funeral was held on the first day of school. To go on, in 1999, my 17-year-old cousin was killed. 2001, my dad committed suicide. That was a very difficult death to deal with. 2004, Brian lost his dad. And the worst part about that is Leonard had spent his entire life depressed and wanting to die. And then at the very end, he finally wanted to live, but his life was over. In 2006, my grandpa passed away after having a stroke. He was very close to me. He was like my dad. He's the one that raised me. In 2010, my dad's mom passed away, so my grandma. And the thing about her death is it was easier because she was ready. She was a Christian, she loved God, and then she even addressed the family in a letter during her funeral, wanting everyone to accept God. So that shows that some of us are ready to go in the grave. In April of 2011, my brother passed away. He was 32 years old, and that was a suicide. That following November, Brian's mom passed away at the age of 60. Leukemia, she had other health problems. She wasn't ready to go. And then in 2013, I lost my grandma, and she was the one that raised me. I'm going to talk more about her story here in a minute. And just a couple days after she passed away, Brian's stepdad passed away. We actually had to attend his funeral before my grandma's was ready. Those were the last significant deaths I've had to deal with. There were so many of them over that time period that I started becoming paranoid and trying to guess who was going to be next. Who was going to die? How were they going to die? That's no way to live. And God doesn't want us to live in fear about losing our friends and family. I mentioned the loss of my grandma, and her story is so significant that this is something that I just want to share with you. I was close to my grandma. I talked to her on a daily basis. Like I said, she was more like my mom. She raised me. Well, one day when I was at work, it was on a Tuesday, I received a phone call telling me that there had been an ambulance at my grandma's house and no one knew what had happened, if she was okay. Well, eventually I found out that she was sent to the Boone County Hospital, to the emergency room. She had been found by her Meals on Wheels driver sitting in her chair. She was unconscious with blood flowing out of her nose that had actually dried up. So they don't know how long sitting there, hours, more than likely. So of course I rushed to Boone from Fort Dodge to the emergency room, and by the time we got there, they wouldn't let us in until my mom finally came and my aunt came, so they let us go back to see her, and the doctor told us that she didn't think there was anything they could do for her. They didn't know what was wrong with her, and they thought that she was dying. At that moment, I just felt peace. I knew that God was going to take care of the situation. And I knew, the truth about death and that we're going to be resurrected together. But other family members of mine weren't ready to give up quite so easily. And so the decision was made to fly her to Mercy. But once we arrived at Mercy, the emergency room doctor told us the same thing. We don't know what's wrong with her. We think she's dying. She hasn't been responsive all day. They placed her in ICU, but before we left the emergency room, our pastor had met us there, and we prayed. We prayed for her healing. And that's exactly what happened. God healed her. The next day, she was awake. She didn't have any recollection of what had happened the day before, and she was back to her old self. Of course, the doctors didn't know what was wrong with her. They couldn't figure it out. She had other issues. She was anemic. They were trying to figure out why. So she ended up spending the next 2 weeks in the hospital, test after test after test. She was uncomfortable. She hated being there. At the end of the 2 weeks, she was supposed to go home the next day. But I had called her. This was August 14th on a Wednesday. I was on my way to work, and I had an extended drive, so I often called her and talked to her. So that morning I talked to her, and she was pretty excited. She was going to come home. She was a little frustrated. They had to do another test on her. I noticed that she had some breathing issues. She did have asthma, but she reassured me that everything was okay. She was just really excited about coming home the next day, so we made plans for me to go down and pick her up. The moment I got off the phone, I had this deep conviction that I needed to go see her that day. It was plain as day. God told me, you need to go see her. She's going to die today. And that was first thing in the morning. I hadn't even gotten to my first store. So I rushed through my work that day, worked very quickly. I kept thinking, we've got Bible study tonight. I don't think I should go. She's supposed to come home tomorrow. I was trying to justify not going all day long. But God convicted me, and that thought just kept going through my head that day. So I decided to go ahead and go to Des Moines to go see her at the hospital. And I called Brian, told him I was going to run down there. Didn't tell him why. I didn't want to sound like I was crazy or anything. Sometimes you just want to keep thoughts in your head. So I got down to Des Moines. It was just after 4 o'clock. Since I hadn't eaten, I ran down and got a salad and brought it up. And she was fine. She was perfectly okay. She complained about not being able to eat that day. She was waiting to have her test done. She couldn't eat until the MRI was done. And then she said it wasn't scheduled until 7 o'clock. While I was there, one of her doctors came in, pulled her off her blood pressure medicine because he thought that's what was causing her breathing issues. And so I'm like, well, she's fine, everything's fine. I'll just head home, I'll make it to Bible study, everything will be great. But I hesitated. I kept thinking, I need to go home. I don't want to, be in this traffic, it gets nasty. I don't like driving in the dark. Well, 5 o'clock rolls around and they bring in her first dose of medicine. It was contrast dye. It's the stuff that they put through you so they can see you better. I don't know, I'm not a nurse or a doctor, but it's to help them. They were trying to identify what was bleeding internally, causing her anemia. And so I was still there for her third dose at 6:30. And I'm still thinking, she's fine, I should go home. I hate driving in the dark. But as she finished that third dose, she started having more breathing issues, and she said that her inhaler had run out, so the nurse brought her in a new one and just set it on the table. Well, I noticed my grandma didn't get up and grab it, so I went and took it around to her, and she couldn't even use it. She kind of fumbled around with it. I'm like, that's a little strange. But I went back and sat down. And then she said that she needed to use the bathroom, but she never got up. So I went back around and I tried to pull her up to get her up, and I realized she's not responsive. She's not talking. She can't get her up. So that's when I called the nurse in. And the nurse agreed that, there was something seriously wrong. And, very quickly there was a whole team of people in the room, and I sat there in the chair texting Brian, asked him to pray. They were in Bible study at that point in time. I also knew that I wasn't crazy. God told me to go that day, and he kept me there. I got kicked out of the room, and then that gave me the opportunity to call my mom and my aunt, and I told them it wasn't good, that they needed to come down to Des Moines. And my aunt just absolutely refused. It was too late for her to drive. So I waited for my mom to show up, and my brother came, and they took my grandma back down to ICU. And so after waiting until my mom got there, we finally went in, and she had been unresponsive. We sat in the room with her for a while. We watched blood getting pumped out of her stomach. She was on the ventilator. But after a couple hours, the doctor came in with the nurse, and they opened her eyes and shined light in her eyes, and there was no response. So the doctor took us in a little room, and he told us that she was brain dead. So it was in the middle of the night, and we had to call all of the family down to say goodbye. And So we waited for my aunt and then my uncle to show up, and then we took her off of the life support, and she passed away. She ended up dying from anaphylaxis. She was allergic to the contrast dye, and no one had known about it. I mean, there was really nothing anyone could do. You know, we can't blame anyone as much as we wanted to. It also makes me sad to think that if we wouldn't have prayed for her healing that day that she first went into the hospital, that she wouldn't have had to sit in the hospital for 2 weeks being poked and prodded and having all those tests ran. She was miserable. In my opinion, it would have been better for her to die that day. But God allowed her to be healed for those 2 weeks to give us the opportunity to be used to living without her being around. God always knows what's best, but he still sometimes gives us what we ask for. Revelation 14:13 says, "Then I heard a voice from heaven say, 'Write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Lord, they will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them.'" Now I have another story to share with you. This one's about me. In 2014, I started realizing I was pretty sick. I was starting to have a lot of pain. So I went to the doctor, and they kind of blew it off, so I ignored it. But it got to the point that I was taking painkillers constantly all day long, 2 and 3 Aleve on top of Tylenol. Just to make it through the day. I was spending so much time in bed, I was sick. Eventually, after going through 3 different doctors, I finally had one that agreed to do a laparoscopic surgery to find out if I had endometriosis or not. And I did. So that was in February of 2015. We had the surgery and I was diagnosed, but that's all they were there to do. So they closed me up, and I mean, it was obvious that I needed to have a hysterectomy, but it's not good on your body to have surgeries too close together, so I had to wait about 2 months. And so we had scheduled my next surgery in April, and this was during the prophecy series that we had done in Ames. So I was helping with that, table leader, and so it just kind of gives you a little bit of a timeline there. The day before my surgery, they called me and told me that it had been canceled because my insurance company was refusing to approve it. I was very frustrated with that. I called the insurance company myself, argued with them for some time, and they just told me no. Well, at that point in time, I was so looking forward to having the surgery. I just knew it was going to give me relief. And then having that taken away from me just crushed me. That Thursday morning that I was supposed to be in for surgery, I spent the day in bed crying, pleading with God. Basically, I told him that if I couldn't be healed, I didn't want to live any longer. It was too hard. After 3-4 hours of prayer and, just that time, I finally told God that, I don't want to die, I want to live. And even if I can't be healed, I would serve him to the best of my ability. Well, the moment I got off the phone, or the moment I stopped praying, the phone rang, and it was my nurse telling me that the insurance company had finally approved my surgery and that they were shuffling patients around so I could have it the next day. I was so thankful for that. Just beyond belief. Well, the next day, I had gone in for surgery, and the surgery that was supposed to take an hour, and it was supposed to be laparoscopic, but they ended up having to cut me all the way open because they found out that the endometriosis tissue had glued my uterus to my colon. So the surgery that was supposed to be simple became very risky. if they nicked my colon. I mean, it was basically a death wish. So that surgery ended up being 4.5 hours long. When I came out of the surgery, I was on a lot of medications, very powerful painkillers, and my body was so relaxed that I was forgetting to breathe. They kept telling me, you have to breathe, and it's like I'm trying, you know? But I don't know exactly the timeline, but somehow I ended up getting a fever. I had a fever of 105. They had no explanation to it. They took me in for a CT scan of my stomach. They couldn't find anything wrong. But during this time, during my stay in the hospital, Brian really didn't leave my side. Dylan was there with me a lot. My mom brought Johnny in to see me. But with that fever, they got really worried about me, to the extent that it was the middle of the night and my doctor came in to check on me not once but twice. The nurse told Brian it wasn't good. Of course, I wasn't aware of what was going on, but I did have a conversation with Jesus. It was a really significant experience that I'll never forget. It was like I was in this white room. It's not like I was seeing the light at the end of the tunnel or anything, but I don't remember seeing him, but I was conversing with him. I was talking to him. And we talked about my life. We talked about how easy it would be for me just to go to sleep, and I wouldn't have to suffer anymore. I wouldn't have any of that pain, and that he would wake me up at the end of time. At that very moment, I was assured of my salvation. We also talked about my family. I told him that I wanted to live. I wanted to be with my family. My family needed me. I talked to him about all the loss that my family had faced, and I couldn't see them living without me, and I didn't want them to live without me. Well, in the middle of that prayer conversation, I opened my eyes, and there's Brian and Dylan sitting there. And I just told Brian, pray for me. I didn't know what was going to happen. I wasn't sure, and he didn't know either. But almost as quickly as that fever came on, it went away. And they were never able to figure out what caused the fever. The thing that I've learned from both the experiences of mine and my grandma's is that God is so loving and merciful that he can even use death as a way to bless those who are tired and worn out. Isaiah 57:2 says, "Those who walk uprightly enter into peace. They find rest as they lie in death." Naturally, we don't want to die. And we definitely don't want to watch our loved ones lose their life. You know, when Jesus was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, from the grave, he stopped and he was talking to Mary, and he was talking to Martha. And the Bible said Jesus wept. The thing about it is, he wasn't weeping for himself. He wasn't weeping for Lazarus. He knew that Lazarus was going to be raised from the dead. He wept because he felt the pain of those around him. Isaiah 57:1-2 says, "The righteous perish, and no one takes it to heart. The devout are taken away, and no one understands that the righteous are taken away to be spared from evil." As we get closer to the end of time, Ellen White talked about how God's going to put some people to sleep. Those who are not able to endure the trials, those who are too weak. Counsels on Health, page 375, said, "It is not always safe to ask for unconditional healing. He knows whether or not those for whom petition are offered would be able to endure the trial and test that would come upon them if they lived. He knows the end from the beginning. Many will be laid away asleep before the fiery ordeal of the time of trouble shall come upon our world. She also said in selected messages, "The Lord has often instructed me that many little ones are to be laid away before the time of trouble." She says that we shall see our children again. We shall meet them and know them in the heavenly courts. When we face the loss of our loved ones, our family, our friends, parents, grandparents, and even children, we are assured that God is doing what is best for them. We don't understand it, and it's painful. But we can find comfort and peace in Jesus. Revelation 14:13 says, "Then I heard a voice from heaven say, 'Write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes,' says the Spirit, 'they will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them.'" The three things that I want everyone to take away from the message today is that God is merciful. Death can be a blessing because it ends our trials and our suffering in this life. Second, listen to God. I could have missed those last few hours with my grandmother if I would have ignored what he was telling me. When he speaks to you, don't ignore his voice. And then remember that God knows everything. Trust him and allow him to lead you, especially through the most difficult times in your life. We have our closing hymn.